All right, let's now shift our attention to what is happening in Afghanistan, where the Taliban has now announced its very first budget for the country. The budget has been announced for the first time since the hardline Islamists returned to power in the month of August last year. But before the Taliban took charge, about 75% of the public spending, interestingly, was funded by foreign aid and grants. Noticeably, the international assistance represented almost about 40% of Afghanistan's GDP. The foreign aid made up of 80% of the budget spending when the former American-backed government was in control of Kabul. But now, all the aid that was coming in from abroad, remember, has been frozen. But according to reports, there is some bit of humanitarian aid that is still continuing to trickle in. But the Taliban budget mentions nothing about the foreign assistance that is now slowly trickling back into Afghanistan again. The Taliban's finance ministry spokesperson Ahmed Wali Hakmal touted the budget to be independent of any foreign interference. A big achievement is how he described it. The approved budget is of $508 million and that will cover the cost of the first quarter of the year 2022. The Islamists are all set to announce their first annual budget in the month of March. The fiscal year has also been shifted to match with Afghanistan's solar calendar. The finance ministry spokesperson has also added that the Taliban exchequer is funded by their own resources, and this includes tax, trade and mining revenue. Less than 10% of the amount is expected to be spent on developmental projects, which will include transport, infrastructure, and the budget is almost entirely dedicated to funding the government institutions. The state workers who have not been paid for several months will start receiving salaries by the end of January. Women staff who have been blocked entrance from offices from returning to their jobs will also be paid. When Kabul crumbled in the month of August last year, the Taliban took charge of Kabul. Western powers had frozen billions of dollars of Afghan assets, money that belonged to the Afghans, and now the nation is of course grappling with the task of trying to provide even the basic humanitarian necessities. At this point of time, many international charities and also some of the international nations have of course said that they are looking for ways and means to try and channel the aid into Afghanistan, but they do not want the aid to fall into the hands of the Taliban. The millions in Afghanistan are facing hunger due to an acute crisis in the availability of fuel and food in the impoverished country. According to the World Food Programme Director for Afghanistan, the country is facing its worst hunger crisis ever. And according to the United Nations Humanitarian Organization, nearly about 22.8 million people are facing acute food shortages, while about 8.7 million of those are said to be almost on the verge of starvation.
All that is coming together into an absolute tsunami of hunger that's just sweeping across the country, and probably is, despite, 5 decades of war, it's probably it is the worst crisis Afghanistan has ever faced.
The United Nations has launched its biggest ever appeal. It has called for almost about $5 billion to help 22 million Afghans. The appeal will be followed by a pledging conference in the middle of March. A number of different nations have announced new funding. An additional $308 million is expected to be announced by the United States, while the tiny state of Israel will be chipping in with a contribution of about $500,000. There are also indications that more funds are expected from other nations. Now, as Afghanistan continues to spiral deeper into poverty, a growing number of destitute people are making some extremely desperate decisions. The people who are in dire need of money have taken to risking their lives by selling their kidneys. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.